I did not want to interrupt the account of the Battle of Eylau to tell you what happened to me in that terrible conflict, but, to help you fully understand this grim tale, I must go back to the autumn of 1805, to the moment when the officers of the Grande Armée, making their preparations for the Battle of Austerlitz, were completing their kits. I had 2 good horses, and I was looking for a third, a better one, a battle horse. That was hard to find, because, although horses were infinitely less expensive than today, their price was still quite high, and I had little money, but chance served me wonderfully. I met a learned German, named Monsieur Deiste, whom I had known when he taught at Corrèze. He had become tutor to the children of a rich Swiss banker, Monsieur Scherer, established in Paris and partner of Monsieur Fingerlin. Monsieur Deiste told me that Monsieur Fingerlin, then very wealthy and living in grand style, had a large stable in which the foremost place was held by a charming mare called Lisette, an excellent Mecklenburg animal with gentle gaits, light as a doe, and so well trained that a child could ride her. But this mare, when mounted, had a terrible fault, fortunately very rare. She bit like a bulldog, and threw herself furiously upon people who displeased her, which determined Monsieur Fingerlin to sell her. She was bought on behalf of Madame de Lauriston, whose husband, aide-de-camp to the Emperor, had written to have a campaign outfit prepared for him. Monsieur Fingerlin, when selling the mare, having failed to warn of her fault, that very evening a groom was found under her hoofs, whose entrails she had torn out with her fine teeth. Madame de Lauriston, justly alarmed, demanded that the sale be annulled. Not only was it rescinded, but, to prevent further misfortunes, the police ordered that a sign, placed in Lisette's stall, should inform buyers of her ferocity, and that any sale concerning this animal would be null if the purchaser did not declare in writing that he had taken note of the warning. You can imagine that, with such a notice, the mare was very difficult to place. Thus Monsieur Deiste warned me that her owner was determined to part with her for whatever one would give. I offered 1,000 francs, and Monsieur Fingerlin delivered Lisette to me, although she had cost him 5,000. For several months, this animal caused me much trouble. It took 4 or 5 men to saddle her, and one only managed to bridle her by covering her eyes and tying her forelegs, but once you were on her back, you found a truly incomparable mount. However, since, from the time she belonged to me, she had already bitten several people and had not spared me, I was thinking of getting rid of her, when, having taken into my service François Warland, a man who doubted nothing, he, before approaching Lisette, whose bad temper had been pointed out to him, armed himself with a roasted leg of mutton, still very hot. When the animal rushed at him to bite, he presented the leg, which she seized between her teeth. But, having burned her gums, palate, and tongue, the mare gave a cry, dropped the meat, and, from that moment, submitted to Warland, whom she no longer dared attack. I used the same method and obtained the same result. Lisette, docile as a dog, let herself be easily approached by me and by my servant. She even became a little more manageable with the staff grooms, whom she saw every day, but woe to strangers who passed near her. I could cite 20 examples of her ferocity. I will confine myself to one. During Marshal Augereau's stay at the Château de Bellevue, near Berlin, the staff servants, having noticed that when they went to dine, someone came and took the sacks of oats left in the stable, persuaded Warland to leave Lisette untied near the door. The thief arrived, slipped into the stable, and was already carrying off a sack when the mare, seizing him by the nape, dragged him to the middle of the courtyard, where she broke 2 of his ribs by trampling him. People ran to the dreadful cries uttered by the thief, whom Lisette would not release until my servant and I forced her to do so, for, in her fury, she would have rushed upon anyone else. The wickedness of this animal had increased since a Saxon hussar officer, of whom I have spoken to you, had treacherously slashed her shoulder with a saber stroke on the battlefield of Jena. Such was the mare I was riding at Eylau, at the moment when the remnants of Marshal Augereau's corps, crushed by a hail of canister and round shot, were trying to rally near the great cemetery. You will remember that the 14th of the line had remained alone on a small hillock, which it was not to leave except by order of the emperor. The snow having ceased momentarily, one could see that intrepid regiment, which, surrounded by the enemy, waved its eagle aloft to prove that it still held and asked for help. The emperor, moved by the magnanimous devotion of those brave men, resolved to try to save them by ordering Marshal Augereau to send to them an officer charged to tell them to leave the hillock, form a small square, and make for us, while a cavalry brigade would march to meet them to support their efforts. This was before Murat's great charge. It was almost impossible to carry out the emperor's will, because a swarm of Cossacks separated us from the 14th of the line, and it was evident that the officer to be sent to that unfortunate regiment would be killed or captured before reaching it. However, the order being positive, the marshal had to comply. It was customary, in the imperial army, for aides-de-camp to stand in file a few steps from their general, and for the one at the head to set off first, then take position at the end after carrying out his mission, so that, each carrying an order in turn, the dangers would be equally shared. A brave engineer captain, named Froissart, who, although not an aide-de-camp, was attached to the marshal, being nearer to him, was tasked with carrying the order to the 14th. Monsieur Froissart set off at a gallop. We lost sight of him in the midst of the Cossacks, and we never saw him again, nor learned what became of him. The marshal, seeing that the 14th did not move, sent an officer named David. He met the same fate as Froissart. We heard no more of him. It is likely that both, having been killed and stripped, could not be recognized amid the numerous corpses that covered the ground. For the third time, the marshal called, "The officer to advance." It was my turn. Seeing the son of his former friend, and, I dare say, his favorite aide-de-camp approach, the good marshal's face was moved, his eyes filled with tears, for he could not hide from himself that he was sending me to almost certain death, but the emperor had to be obeyed. I was a soldier. One could not send one of my comrades in my place, and I would not have allowed it. That would have dishonored me. I therefore dashed off. But, while making the sacrifice of my life, I thought I should take the necessary precautions to save it. I had noticed that the two officers who set out before me had put sabres in hand, which led me to believe that they intended to defend themselves against the Cossacks who would attack them along the way, a defense, in my opinion, ill-considered, since it forced them to stop to fight a multitude of enemies who ended up overwhelming them. I went about it differently and, leaving my sabre in its scabbard, considered myself as a rider who, wishing to win a race, heads as quickly as possible and by the shortest line toward the indicated goal, without worrying about what lies to the right or to the left along his path. Now, my goal being the hillock occupied by the 14th of the line, I resolved to reach it without paying attention to the Cossacks, whom I nullified in my mind. This method succeeded perfectly. Lisette, lighter than a swallow, and flying rather than running, devoured the distance, clearing heaps of the corpses of men and horses, ditches, broken gun carriages, as well as the poorly extinguished fires of the bivouacs. Thousands of scattered Cossacks covered the plain. The first who saw me did as beaters do in a hunt, when, seeing a hare, they signal its presence to one another with cries of, "Yours, yours." But none of those Cossacks tried to stop me, first, because of the extreme speed of my run, and probably also because, being in very great number, each of them thought that I could not avoid his comrades posted further on. So I escaped them all and reached the 14th of the line, without either I or my excellent mare receiving the slightest scratch. I found the 14th formed in square on the top of the hillock, but since the slopes of the ground were quite gentle, the enemy cavalry had been able to make several charges against the French regiment, which, having vigorously repulsed them, was surrounded by a ring of the corpses of horses and Russian dragoons, forming a sort of rampart that now made the position almost inaccessible to cavalry, for, despite the help of our infantrymen, I had great difficulty in getting over that bloody and dreadful breastwork. I was at last inside the square. Since the death of Colonel Savary, killed at the passage of the Yukra, the 14th was commanded by a battalion chief. When, amid a hail of round shot, I delivered to that officer the order to leave his position and try to rejoin the corps, he pointed out to me that the enemy artillery, firing at the 14th for an hour, had caused such losses that the handful of soldiers left to him would be infallibly exterminated if it went down into the plain. That, moreover, he would not have time to prepare the execution of that movement, since a Russian infantry column, marching upon him, was no more than 100 paces from us. "I see no way to save the regiment," said the battalion chief. "Return to the Emperor, give him the final respects of the 14th of the line, which has faithfully executed his orders, and carry to him the eagle he had given us, and which we can no longer defend. It would be too painful, in dying, to see it fall into the enemy's hands." The commander then handed me his eagle, which the soldiers, the glorious remnants of that intrepid regiment, saluted for the last time with cries of "Long live the Emperor!" They who were going to die for him. It was Tacitus's "Caesar, we who are about to die salute you." But here that cry was uttered by heroes. Infantry eagles were very heavy, and their weight was increased by a long stout staff of oak, to the top of which it was fixed. The length of that staff greatly encumbered me, and since that pole, without its eagle, could not constitute a trophy for the enemy, I resolved, with the commander's assent, to break it so as to carry only the eagle. But, at the moment when, from the top of my saddle, I bent my body forward to have more strength to separate the eagle from the staff, one of the many balls the Russians were sending us passed through the back brim of my hat a few lines from my head. The shock was all the more terrible because my hat, being held by a strong leather strap fastened under the chin, offered more resistance to the blow. I was as if annihilated, but did not fall from the horse. Blood flowed from my nose, my ears, and even my eyes, yet I still heard, I saw, I understood, and kept all my mental faculties, although my limbs were paralyzed to the point that it was impossible for me to move a single finger. Meanwhile, the Russian infantry column we had just seen was reaching the hillock. These were grenadiers whose metal-trimmed caps had the shape of mitres. These men, filled with brandy, and in a number infinitely superior, hurled themselves furiously upon the feeble remnants of the unfortunate 14th, whose soldiers had, for several days, lived only on potatoes and melted snow, and that day had not even had time to prepare that wretched meal. Nevertheless, our brave Frenchmen defended themselves valiantly with their bayonets, and when the square had been broken, they gathered in several small groups and sustained that unequal combat for a long time. During that dreadful melee, several of ours, so as not to be struck from behind, pressed themselves against the flank of my mare, who, contrary to her habits, remained very impassive. If I had been able to move, I would have urged her forward to take her away from that field of carnage, but it was absolutely impossible for me to press my legs to make my mount understand my will. My position was all the more frightful in that, as I have already said, I had kept the faculty of seeing and thinking. Not only were they fighting around me, which exposed me to bayonet thrusts, but a Russian officer, with a horrid face, was constantly trying to pierce me with his sword, and as the crowd of combatants prevented him from reaching me, he pointed me out with gestures to the soldiers around him, who, taking me for the French commander, because I alone was mounted, fired at me over the heads of their comrades, so that very many bullets constantly whistled past my ears. One of them would certainly have taken the little life left in me, when a terrible incident removed me from that frightful melee. Among the French who had pressed against the left flank of my mare was a quartermaster whom I knew, having often seen him at the marshals, where he copied the situation returns. This man, attacked and wounded by several enemy grenadiers, fell under Lisette's belly and was grasping my leg to try to get up, when a Russian grenadier, whose drunkenness made his steps very uncertain, wishing to finish him by piercing his chest, lost his balance, and the point of his bayonet, badly directed, went astray in my cloak, swollen by the wind. The Russian, seeing that I did not fall, left the quartermaster to deliver me an infinity of blows, at first useless, but one of which, finally striking me, pierced my left arm, from which I felt, with a dreadful pleasure, the warm blood flow. The Russian grenadier, redoubling his fury, aimed another thrust at me, when the force he put into it made him stumble, and his bayonet sank into my mare's thigh, who, driven by pain back to her ferocious instincts, threw herself upon the Russian, and with a single bite tore off, with her teeth, his nose, his lips, his eyelids, as well as all the skin of his face, and made of him a living skull, all red. It was horrible to see. Then, hurling herself furiously into the midst of the combatants, Lisette, kicking and biting, knocked down everything she met along her path. The enemy officer, who had so often tried to strike me, having wanted to seize her by the bridle, she grabbed him by the belly, and, lifting him easily, carried him away from the melee, down the hillock, where, after tearing out his entrails with her teeth and crushing his body under her hoofs, she left him dying on the snow. Then, taking again the path by which she had come, she made a triple gallop toward Eylau's cemetery. Thanks to the hussar-style saddle in which I sat, I kept my seat, but a new danger awaited me. The snow had begun again to fall, and large flakes dimmed the daylight, when, near Eylau, I found myself in front of a battalion of the old guard, which, unable to distinguish at a distance, took me for an enemy officer leading a cavalry charge. The whole battalion immediately fired upon me. My cloak and my saddle were riddled with bullets, but I was not wounded, nor was my mare, who, continuing her swift run, passed through the 3 ranks of the battalion with the same ease as a snake passes through a hedge, but that last dash having exhausted Lisette's strength, for one of the large veins in her thigh had been cut, and she was losing much blood, the poor beast suddenly gave way and fell to one side, making me roll to the other, stretched out on the snow, among heaps of dead and dying, unable to move in any way. I gradually, and without pain, lost consciousness of myself. It seemed to me that I was being gently rocked. At last, I fainted completely, without being roused by the great crashing the 90 squadrons of Murat made, going to the charge as they passed near me, and perhaps over me. I estimate that my swoon lasted 4 hours, and when I regained my senses, here was the horrible position in which I found myself. I was completely naked, having only my hat and my right boot. A soldier of the train, thinking me dead, had stripped me according to custom, and, wanting to tear off the only boot that remained, was pulling me by one leg, pressing one of his feet upon my belly. The strong jerks that man gave me doubtless revived me. I managed to raise my upper body and to bring up clots of blood that blocked my throat. The shock produced by the wind of the cannonball had caused such a considerable bruise that my face, shoulders, and chest were black, while the blood from my arm wound reddened the other parts of my body. My hat and my hair were filled with blood-stained snow. I rolled my eyes wildly, and must have been horrible to see. The soldier of the train turned his head away, and walked off with my belongings, without my being able to address a single word to him, so great was my state of prostration. But I had recovered my mental faculties, and my thoughts turned toward God and toward my mother. The sun, as it set, cast a few faint rays through the clouds. I bade it farewell, which I believed to be my last. If only, I said to myself, I had not been stripped. Someone among the many people passing near me, noticing the gold braids that covered my pelisse, would recognize that I am a marshal's aide-de-camp, and might perhaps have me carried to the field hospital. But, seeing me naked, they confound me with the many corpses that surround me, and soon, indeed, there will be no difference between them and me. I cannot call for help, and the night that approaches will take away all hope of being rescued. The cold is increasing. Will I be able to endure it until tomorrow, when already I feel my naked limbs growing stiff? I therefore expected to die, for if one miracle had saved me in the midst of the dreadful melee of the Russians and the 14th, could I hope that another miracle would draw me from the horrible position in which I found myself? That second miracle did occur, and here is how. Marshal Augereau had a valet named Pierre Danel, a very intelligent, very devoted fellow, but a bit of a reasoner. Now, it had happened, during our stay at La Houssaye, that Danel, having given his master a saucy answer, was dismissed. Danel, in despair, begged me to intercede for him. I did so with such zeal that I succeeded in getting him restored to favor with the marshal. From that moment, the valet had vowed great attachment to me. This man, who had left all the baggage at Landsberg, set out of his own accord on the day of the battle to bring his master provisions, which he had placed in a very light wagon, able to pass everywhere, and containing the objects the marshal most often used. That small wagon was driven by a soldier who had served in the train company to which the soldier who had just stripped me belonged. The latter, laden with my effects, passed near the wagon, stopped beside the cemetery, and, recognizing the postilion, his former comrade, approached him to show the brilliant loot he had just collected from a dead man. Now, you must know that during our stay in the Vistula cantonments, the marshal having sent Danel to fetch provisions in Warsaw, I had instructed him to have the black astrakhan fur removed from my pelisse, so it could be replaced with grey astrakhan, newly adopted by Prince Berthier's aides-de-camp, who set the fashion in the army. I was still the only officer on Marshal Augereau's staff who had grey astrakhan. Danel, present at the display the train soldier was making, easily recognized my pelisse, which led him to look more closely at the other effects of the supposed dead man, among which he found my watch, marked with my father's cipher, to whom it had belonged. The valet no longer doubted that I had been killed, and while lamenting my loss, he wished to see me one last time, and, having himself guided by the train soldier, he found me alive. The joy of that good man, to whom I certainly owed my life, was immense. He hastened to fetch my servant, a few orderlies, and to have me carried into a barn, where he rubbed my body with rum, while they searched for Dr. Raymond, who finally arrived, dressed the wound on my arm, and declared that the outpouring of blood it had caused would save me. Soon, I was surrounded by my brother and my comrades. They gave something to the train soldier who had taken my clothes, which he returned very willingly, but as they were soaked with water and blood, Marshal Augereau had me wrapped in some of his own garments. The Emperor had authorized the marshal to go to Landsberg, but, his wound preventing him from mounting a horse, his aides-de-camp had procured a sledge on which a cabriolet box had been placed. The marshal, who could not bring himself to abandon me, had me strapped beside him, for I was too weak to sit up. Before they lifted me from the battlefield, I had seen my poor Lisette near me. The cold, by coagulating the blood from her wound, had stopped its heavy flow. The animal had gotten back on her legs and was eating the straw the soldiers had used for their bivouacs the previous night. My servant, who was very fond of Lisette, having noticed her while helping to carry me, went back to fetch her, and, cutting into strips the shirt and greatcoat of a dead soldier, used them to wrap the poor mare's thigh, thus putting her in a state to walk to Landsberg. The commander of the small garrison of that place, having had the considerate thought to prepare lodgings for the wounded, the staff was placed in a large good inn, so that, instead of passing the night without aid, lying naked on the snow, I was laid in a good bed and surrounded by the care of my brother, my comrades, and the good Dr. Raymond. He had been obliged to cut the boot the trained soldier had not been able to remove, and which was still difficult to take off, so swollen was my foot. You will see later that this nearly cost me a leg, and perhaps my life. We spent 36 hours in Landsberg. That rest, and the good care taken of me, restored the use of my voice and my limbs, and when, on the second day after the battle, Marshal Augereau set out for Warsaw, I was able, although very weak, to be transported in the sledge. Our journey lasted 8 days because the staff advanced in short stages with its horses. I was gradually regaining my strength, but, as it returned, I felt an icy cold in my right foot. Upon arriving in Warsaw, I was lodged in the quarters reserved for the marshal, which was all the more favorable as I could not leave my bed. However, the wound in my arm was doing well, the blood that had infiltrated my body as a result of the cannonball shock was beginning to disperse, my skin was regaining its natural color, and the doctor did not know to what to attribute my inability to get up. Hearing me complain of my leg, he wanted to examine it, and what did he see? My foot was gangrenous. An accident dating back to my earliest years was the cause of this new misfortune that struck me. At Corrèze, my right foot had been pierced by the unbuttoned foil of a classmate with whom I was fencing. It would appear that the muscles, made sensitive, had suffered greatly from the cold while I lay unconscious on the battlefield of Eylau. The result was a swelling that explains the difficulty the trained soldier had in tearing off my right boot. The foot was frostbitten, and, not having been treated in time, gangrene had set in at the site of the old wound from the foil thrust. It was covered with an eshar as wide as a 5-franc piece. The doctor turned pale on seeing my foot. Then, having me held by 4 servants and arming himself with a scalpel, he removed the eshar and dug into my foot to extract the dead flesh, exactly as one scrapes out the spoiled parts of an apple. I suffered greatly, yet without complaining, but it was not the same when the scalpel, reaching the living flesh, laid bare the muscles and bones, whose movements could be seen. The doctor, climbing onto a chair, dipped a sponge in hot wine with sugar, which he let fall drop by drop into the hole he had just made in my foot. The pain became intolerable. Nevertheless, for 8 days, I had to endure that dreadful torment, morning and evening, but my leg was saved. Today, when promotions and decorations are so prodigally granted, a reward would certainly be given to an officer who braved the dangers I faced in riding to the 14th of the line, but under the Empire, this act of devotion was considered so natural that they did not give me the cross, and it did not even occur to me to ask for it. A long rest having been judged necessary for the marshal's recovery, the Emperor wrote to urge him to be treated in France and sent for Marshal Masséna from Italy, to whose staff my brother, Bro, and several of my comrades were assigned. Marshal Augereau took me with him, as well as Dr. Raymond and his secretary. I had to be carried to get in and out of the carriage. Moreover, I felt my health grow stronger as I left those glacial regions and moved toward a milder climate. My mare spent her winter in the stables of Monsieur de Launay, the army's forage administrator. The marshal headed from Warsaw toward Silesia via Rawa. As long as we were in dreadful Poland, where there were no paved roads, it took 12 and up to 16 horses to pull the carriage out of the ruts and marshes through which we moved. Even then, it went only at a walk, and it was only upon arriving in Germany that we finally found a civilized country and proper roads. We stopped in Dresden and spent 10 to 12 days in Frankfurt on Main, from where we had set out the previous October to march against Prussia. At last, we reached Paris around the 15th of March. I walked with great difficulty, my arm was in a sling, and I still felt the terrible shock produced by the blast of the cannonball. But the happiness of seeing my mother again, and the good care she gave me, joined to the gentle influence of spring, completed my recovery. Before leaving Warsaw, I had wanted to throw away the hat the cannonball had pierced, but the marshal, having had it kept as a curiosity, gave it to my mother. It still exists today in my possession, and it is a family monument that must be preserved. That concludes the 26th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.